Before we start, I need to give you a warning that most videos on this topic skip entirely. Quantum mechanics gets misused online more than almost any other area of science. You've probably seen the claims. Quantum physics proves your thoughts create reality. Scientists proved consciousness controls the universe. Most of that is oversimplified at best, and flatly wrong at worst. So today, we're going to do something a little different from our usual approach. We're going to look honestly at what quantum mechanics actually shows, separate it carefully from the popular mythology, and then ask a much more careful, much more limited question. Is there a real serious interpretation held by real physicists in which consciousness plays some kind of fundamental role in reality? And if so, how strong is it really, and how weak? This is quantum physics and the question of mind, done as carefully as we can manage in 10 minutes. Let's start with the experiment that gets referenced constantly in this conversation, the double-slit experiment. Here's the setup. You fire particles, electrons, or even photons of light, one at a time toward a barrier with two narrow slits cut into it, with a detector screen behind it. If you don't try to measure which slit each particle goes through, you get a strange pattern building up on the screen over time. An interference pattern, the kind you'd expect from overlapping waves, as if each individual particle somehow passed through both slits simultaneously and interfered with itself. But here's the part that gets people's attention. If you set up a device to measure, or detect, which specific slit each particle actually travels through, the interference pattern disappears. The particles start behaving like ordinary, localized particles going through one slit or the other, not like spread out waves. Something about the act of measurement changes the outcome. This is real, well-established, thoroughly repeated experimental physics, not a myth. The open question is what it actually means. And this is exactly where the popular version of the story usually goes wrong. Here's the crucial distinction that most viral content on this topic blurs completely, and it matters enormously. In standard quantum mechanics, what physicists mean by measurement or observation is not the same thing as a conscious mind looking at something. A measuring device, a simple detector, a piece of equipment with no consciousness whatsoever, is fully sufficient to collapse the interference pattern in the double-slit experiment. The particle's interaction with any sufficiently large, sufficiently classical system, a photographic plate, an electronic sensor, even certain kinds of interactions with the surrounding environment, is enough to produce the effect. No human being needs to be looking at the result or even aware that the experiment happened for the pattern to change. The dominant mainstream explanation for this among physicists is called decoherence. The idea that when a quantum system interacts with a large, complex environment, the delicate wave-like properties get rapidly smeared out and effectively lost, in a way that has nothing to do with conscious awareness and everything to do with basic physical interaction. Most working physicists, when pressed, will tell you that observer in quantum mechanics is really just physics jargon for any interaction with a measuring apparatus, not a mind paying attention. This is important to say plainly. The popular claim that quantum physics has proven consciousness creates reality is not the mainstream scientific position, and presenting it that way would be dishonest. So does that mean the whole consciousness and quantum mechanics conversation is nonsense? Not quite. And this is where the topic gets more interesting and more honest. There's a specific minority interpretation, with real, serious physicists behind it, called the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, named after the mathematician John von Neumann and the physicist Eugene Wigner, the same Wigner we talked about a couple episodes back, in the video on why math describes reality. This interpretation makes a careful, specific argument. If you trace the measurement process all the way through, the particle interacts with a detector, the detector interacts with a recording device, that device interacts with a computer, and so on. You can, in principle, keep pushing that chain of physical interactions further and further back. At some point, Wigner argued, that chain has to terminate somewhere that is not itself just another physical system awaiting its own measurement. And he proposed that the only thing that plausibly ends that chain, rather than perpetuating it indefinitely, is a conscious observer's actual awareness of the result. Wigner himself, later in his career, expressed real reservations about how far this idea should be pushed, and it has remained a genuine minority position within physics. Not the mainstream view. Most physicists prefer decoherence-based explanations, or other alternative interpretations like the many worlds interpretation or pilot wave theory, precisely because they don't require introducing something as philosophically loaded as consciousness into the basic equations of physics. But it's worth being fair here. This isn't a fringe conspiracy theory invented by mystics. It's a genuine published interpretation, argued by mathematicians and physicists of serious stature, still discussed in philosophy of physics circles today, even though it remains a minority view. Here's where this connects to something broader than just quantum mechanics specifically. Even setting the consciousness causes collapsor interpretation aside, quantum mechanics as a whole raises a genuinely strange philosophical question that most interpretations have to grapple with in some form. What is the relationship between the mathematical description of a quantum system, a wave function, describing a whole range of possibilities existing at once, and the single, definite, concrete reality we actually experience when we look? Something has to explain that transition from many possibilities to one experienced outcome, and every major interpretation of quantum mechanics has to propose something to account for it. Whether that's decoherence, branching universes in the many worlds view, hidden variables in pilot wave theory, or, in the minority Wigner-style view, a conscious mind itself. What's notable is that this question, how does a world made of probabilities and possibilities become the single, definite, experienced world we live inside, sits right next to the hard problem of consciousness we discussed a couple episodes ago, where physical description alone struggles to explain why there's subjective experience at all. Some physicists and philosophers have wondered whether these two deep, unresolved mysteries, the strange role of measurement in quantum mechanics and the strange, seemingly non-physical nature of conscious experience, might actually be pointing at the same underlying gap, rather than being two unrelated puzzles that happen to occur in the same universe. I want to be very careful here. In the same spirit as the rest of this series, quantum mechanics does not prove that God or a divine mind is required to explain reality. That claim goes well beyond what the physics itself demonstrates, and Christians making design arguments should be cautious about overreaching into territory the science doesn't actually support, because doing so damages credibility for the arguments that genuinely do hold up. What quantum mechanics does show, honestly, is this. Reality, at its most fundamental level, is stranger than a simple, fully mechanical, fully deterministic, just atoms bumping into atoms picture would suggest. The role of measurement observation and the transition from possibility to actuality remains genuinely unresolved. Philosophically, even after a century of extraordinary experimental success on the mathematical side, that doesn't hand you proof of a creator. But it does mean that confident claims that physics has reduced reality to nothing but blind, mindless mechanism are overstating their own case just as much as the pop science memes claiming quantum physics proves consciousness runs the universe. So does quantum physics point to a mind behind reality? The honest answer is, not proof, but not nothing either. A serious, minority scientific interpretation takes consciousness seriously as part of the picture, and even the mainstream interpretations leave open a genuine, unresolved mystery. about how a world of quantum possibility becomes the single, definite, experienced reality we actually live inside. A mystery that sits closer to philosophy and theology than most physics textbooks are comfortable admitting. Colossians chapter 1 says, "Of Christ, in him all things hold together." Maybe that's not a scientific claim. Science can verify directly. But after this, look at quantum mechanics. It's fair to say it's not a claim science can rule out either. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.